Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'd like to welcome you to this HLPF side event, Unleashing Science, Delivering Missions for Sustainability. My name is Nick Ishmael Perkins, and my accent is Barbadian, for those of you who are wondering. I lead the Public Value of Science program at the International Science Council. Before we get into the proceedings, I want to let you know that this session today is being recorded. Today, humanity is at a crossroads and the choice is stark. Either we continue our business as usual practices with potentially severe consequences for all life on Earth, or we collectively transition towards a more sustainable, resilient, and just future. And we have seen how the COVID-19 pandemic underscores the urgency of accelerating societal transformations. Achieving the transformative vision of the SDGs by 2030 requires a substantial realignment of most country and industry priorities towards longer-term, more collaborative and drastically accelerated action. Science is recognized as a critical lever in achieving the SDGs, providing solutions by unlocking actionable knowledge. However, realizing the full potential of science for advancing sustainable development in the next decade requires a system change in the way science is conducted, harnessed, accessed, and funded. Therefore, the global science and science funding community now jointly face a big challenge about how to practice and support science in ways that can really work for sustainable development. This side event builds on the work undertaken through the global initiative known as the Global Forum of Funders. Its purpose, is to regularly convene public and private science funders from around the world to explore how to collaboratively increase the impact of science and science funding on the achievement of the 2030 agenda. The initiative is led by the International Science Council with a consortium of funders, including the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, Sida, the Belmont Forum, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, Canada's International Development Research Centre, IDRC, the National Research Foundation of South Africa, Future Earth, and UK Research and Innovation. It is these partners who have organised today's event. The first Global Forum of Funders, held in 2019, agreed to launch the Decade of Global Sustainability Science Action and asked the ISC to work with the global scientific community under the guidance of the Steering Committee to propose the practical and critical priorities of mission-oriented research. The purpose of this work is to provide different science funders with a common purpose and focus for collaborative action. Today, we will explore the blueprint for the way forward developed by the Steering Committee and key partners in the Global Funders Forum. Now, let me explain a little bit about how today's session will work. We'll start with a presentation of the key recommendations coming out of the forum so far. That presentation will be followed by some reflections from high-level speakers representing major science funding institutions about how they see the initiative on mission-oriented science going forward. This will be followed by a short panel discussion and a Q&A with the audience for up to 20 minutes. Please feel free to share your comments in the chat box throughout the proceedings. And if you have questions, you can put these in the Q&A section, and you do not need to wait actually until we get to that Q&A bit, because if something occurs to you as you are hearing from our panel, just drop it in the Q&A section. Now, I'd like to invite Albert van Jaarsveld, the Director General and Chief Executive Officer at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, to present a framework to unleash mission-oriented science, outlining the critical priorities for science that will support and enable societies to accomplish the SDGs by 2030. Albert, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good day to everybody online. It's wonderful to have you here, and we look forward to an interesting conversation. From my side, I'm going to take you through a few slides, give you some context, but I think let's start off here. Those of you that watch the media will be fully aware of the realities that we face and the fact that we as a humanity are pushing the planet to the limits in terms of its capability to support our livelihoods into the future. This is not new. Science has been warning us about this for some time. The issue around planetary tipping points that are critical for continued life on the planet being particularly pertinent in this conversation. But there's also the other side of the coin, and that is that we're facing a humanity that is increasingly divided. At present, 71% of adults own less than $10,000 in wealth across the globe. Life expectancy has doubled in a century for some, but for some, they are only likely to experience about 12 years of a good life beyond the age of 20. 100 million people experience acute hunger, while 1 billion people are obese. 1% of the 1.3 billion COVID vaccinations injected so far have actually been happening on the African continent. 90% of people breathe highly polluted air. 1 in 9 people use unsafe water, and 2.3 billion people have no access to a toilet. More die by suicide than war and violence on an annual basis, and happiness inequality is on the rise. 1 billion people have no access to electricity, but there are sufficient cell phones in circulation for all. The reality is that 3 billion people have experienced land degradation, desertification, and did not benefit from the great acceleration over the past decades. We have set ourselves goals as a society to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know that we are way off track in terms of delivering on these, and that we have to think differently about the way we go about our business in order to rectify the situation and hopefully pull back some of the yardage that we've lost. The IIASA was charged by the Global Research Council to initiate a process exploring mission-driven science. They went through a process calling for survey inputs from around the globe through an IIASA-led call. There was an expert analysis of agenda-setting reports in this regard to try and identify priorities. And there was a synthesis of the scientific literature conducted. All of these inputs have flowed into the particular report that we're discussing today. At the heart of the matter is that whatever we do and tackle in terms of mission-driven science, it has to revolve around and it has to be part of those elements of our daily lives that form the foundation of all the Sustainable Development Goals that we're trying to deliver on. And that means that we have to focus on the basic needs for humanity. So for science itself, the vision is to support the urgent societal transformations towards a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient future. And for this, we need a nimble, targeted, mission-oriented set of socio-political science initiatives and associated support structures that harness the best of what science offers, but does so in a completely different, albeit a largely proven way, connected seamlessly with other parts of society to implement necessary policies, practices, and behavioral changes. We simply cannot continue with business as usual as far as science is concerned. The current science system, or the dominant science system, has certain elements that you're all very familiar with, institutions, etc. It's organized in silos, largely disciplinary of nature. It's reinforced by cultures and the way it operates, and it's functionally intertwined in terms of the funding systems, the evaluation systems, and the application of knowledge. It operates in a particular context, and collectively, these all shape what and how a scientific knowledge is produced and used, and by whom. As far as the established science system is concerned, in terms of organization, it tends to be narrowly focused, fragmented, distant, and abstracted, and compartmentalized. It's exclusionary in terms of attitudes, and disconnected from society's needs often, elitist, dominated by Western thinking in terms of its orientation, sometimes uncritical, captured by an economic growth mindset. In a science that can deliver societal transformation, we need to operate very differently. We need a science and a support system that enables institutional concentration of extensive brain trust, cross and disciplinary integration, science for the common good, full-time immersion, research shielded from other obligations, sustained effort, financial and institutional, directly linked and accountable to policy and practice. In terms of organization, the science needs to be integrative, system-focused, networked and flexible, transformative, societal needs-led, globally and regionally connected, strength-based and capacitated. In terms of attitude, it needs to be collaborative, embracing transdisciplinarity and open and accessible. In terms of orientation, it needs to be critical, innovative and reflective, driven by the common good, solutions-focused and accountable to society as a whole. So what is mission-driven science or mission science? It is focused on a clearly defined topic, question or goal. Put a man on the moon, for argument's sake. Singularly goal-oriented and solutions-focused. Conducted for a limited period of time until a substantial challenge has been successfully addressed. Significant in size, scope, and ambition, requires co-designed inter- and transdisciplinary approaches, requires direct engagement with policymakers and societal actors, and the science should be accessible and used and applied. In short, it is transformative. Key characteristic of mission science is that it needs to be of a transdisciplinary nature, and that has significant requirements. It means it needs to be co-designed, co-produced, and co-delivered. It's not just about the science, it's about science, society, collaborating and taking hands. In order to deliver a science that can make change happen, there are particular outcomes that we have to strive for. We have to identify those rate-limiting problems that are preventing progress, and they need to be resolved. We need to make sure that we deal with the basic needs as far as the SDGs are concerned. We have to look further than 2030 and beyond for complete sustainability. Whatever we deliver must be more equitable. We need to shift towards integrated, inclusive science governance, and we need to move towards the emergence of accountable public institutions in this regard. There are a couple of assumptions that we make in terms of delivering on mission science. First is that we have to understand that the SDGs, or achieving the SDGs, is a socio-political problem. It's not necessarily a science problem. The current science system inhibits a significant constructive contribution to the SDGs. Incremental reform is not commensurate with the SDG timetables. We have to be doing something differently. Mission-driven science in support of society is a design intervention about the way we go about our science. There are clearly priorities that have to be tackled. We are pursuing the possibility of a dignified and just human existence on this planet. We have to make sure, therefore, meet the basic needs first, and we have to question very sharply what are the rate-limiting questions that are preventing us from achieving those fundamental objectives. The science itself needs to be responsive, supportive, generative, and constructively critical of existing approaches and policies. The approach should be holistic. It should be a systemic approach with high impact to deliver on very clearly defined missions at the end of the day. The partnerships are exhaustive and extensive, all the way from high-level champions to high-level political leadership, through decision makers at all levels, all the way through to civil society. We have to own this problem collectively in order to deliver on it successfully. It's really important that we have to change the conditions that hold unsustainable, unjust systems in place across the planet. This means we have to change mindsets, relationships, vested interests, policies and government systems, resource flows, practices and behaviors, and ensure that we provide the kind of institutional co-designed support that's required to deliver on this collective vision and make sure we can bring together the top-notch scientists and policy experts that can contribute to this exercise. There are a couple of key considerations that we have to keep in mind in this regard. First of all, we must acknowledge that the Sustainable Development Goals and global challenges cannot be achieved unilaterally by any one nation state. It requires a collective global effort to do so. There's a degree of urgency that are associated with this. These priorities have to be tackled at scale, timelessly and collectively. A business as usual or incremental approach will simply mean that we will know with time exactly what we should have done. We have to focus on the global societal priorities in order to deliver a dignified future for humanity. We'll often hear from funders and people, we don't fund practical research, we only fund basic research as institutions. And I think we have to start acknowledging to ourselves that this particular challenge we face is pretty basic, in whatever way you look at it. We have managed in the past to work together, to collaborate on large science infrastructure projects across the globe. There's a whole list of them that we can list. One example is the example of CERN, where we spend collectively and jointly $1.1 billion per annum on a joint project because we think it's important. I want to try and make the case that I think the global challenges we face are important and we should be supporting them in the same manner. These are shared and universal global societal problems that require our collective effort, yet we have not managed to fund these priorities in the same way as some of the other perceived priorities. Give you an example of our current funding systems across the globe. Understandably, most countries focus their funding on their national priorities and competitive capabilities. So the vast majority of their science funding is for internal funding purposes in that regard. There's a small chunk usually of some funding that's made available for bilateral partnerships and relationship building, and a very small bit right at the top of the pyramid that goes towards multilateral science and that has universal access. The problem is that the major global challenges we face, these on the right-hand side, the climate crisis, the sustainability crisis, and the Agenda 2030 objectives, the raging pandemic that we're all living under, trying to achieve a smart economic recovery, and of course, to try and overcome the legitimacy crisis that many governments across the world are facing. These are global issues that we have to tackle and deal with collectively. And therefore, the science and the funding for that science needs to be aligned with the urgency of the matters that we're trying to tackle. We estimate, with an early estimates, that somewhere between $100 and $200 million per annum over a decade may be sufficient to get this process going and hopefully resolve many of these issues. So as far as the implementation of mission science is concerned, the report proposes the establishment of unique sustainability stations that garner sustained political commitment, harness the private sector support, and the best that science and science funders have to offer for a limited period of time to tackle and address every one of these areas of concern. These stations need to be co-designed with key political, private sector, science, and national partners. Again, the principles of transdisciplinarity. What we put in place may disrupt the science as we know it in some places, some existing initiatives, and some of the funding systems that we have in place. We must accept that and acknowledge that. This is a way of doing business differently. You cannot do business differently in the same way, right? We have to accept that. We have clear objectives to harness and optimize transdisciplinary approaches to tackle mission-critical global change societal challenges, and we must identify those catalytic interventions, policy, societal responses, and research, etc., to overcome rate-limiting barriers to transformative societal responses across the global science missions. What are the global science missions? These have to be co-defined within these basic needs domains: food, water, urban areas, energy, and climate. These are the things that underpin all or many of the Sustainable Development Goals, and they embrace the most pressing human challenges that we are faced with. I want to emphasize these have to be co-defined as part of the transdisciplinary process. It's not science's role to define them on behalf of society. Society has to decide their own priorities. So this initiative brings together political leverage, societal influence, engaged governments, the private sector, and all funders. The question is, are we up to this daunting socio-political challenge to step up to the level of ambition that's required? If so, the International Science Council is willing to take this initiative forward together with all of the willing partners around the table. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Albert, for, I think, a very comprehensive reflection on the state of science, the challenges, and I think a very clear blueprint for the way forward. We'll obviously be coming back to tease out more of the actions over the next 45 minutes. But I would like now to invite Ingrid Peterson, who is the Director General of Forumas, the Swedish Research Council. She also represents the Global Research Council here. And this council is comprised of the heads of science and engineering funding agencies from around the world, and dedicated to promoting the best practices for high quality collaboration amongst funding agencies worldwide. Ingrid, we look forward to hearing your perspectives on the role of the GRC, the Global Research Council, in taking forward mission-oriented science for the SDGs.
Thank you very much. And as you said, the Global Research Council is a virtual organization, and it's comprised of the heads of research funding agencies from around the world. And we believe that cooperation and collaboration can enhance the quality of science, avoid unnecessary duplication, provide economies of scale, and address issues that cannot be solved by working together. First, we all know that curiosity-driven and challenge-oriented research are jointly needed to provide knowledge to address the societal challenges. During the last couple of years, the Global Research Council has explored new ways and instruments to fill the most critical knowledge gaps for unlocking sustainability transformation. We have explored mission-oriented research focused on clearly defined topics, challenges, or goals. A mission-oriented research which requires co-design with stakeholders and inter- and transdisciplinary approaches. A research that has to be system-based, solutions-focused and transformative, but also practical to enable the quick uptake we need to see in the decade of action. The work by the Global Forum of Funders, coordinated by the International Science Council and presented here today by Albert van Jasveld, was presented and discussed at the Global Research Council's last meeting in May. The concept aroused great interest, and many funding organizations expressed explicitly their support, and I think there are many willing partners. The Global Research Council will also launch a pilot this fall on how to speed up the uptake of research results. Research and innovation is often seen as national investments to enhance jobs, growth, and welfare. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, as well as pandemics and growing inequalities have, however, no borders. So in order to achieve the SDGs, all countries must invest in the common good and in research and innovation to the benefit of the whole of humanity. For this, we need a strong political commitment, both at global and national level, to take away the hurdles and give support to funders and researchers from all parts of the world to join forces to produce the knowledge we need. The research capacity in the Global South also has to be seriously strengthened to set a true global research and innovation agenda, because nobody should be left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid, for, I think, a very galvanizing statement of intent. No doubt, again, we will be reflecting on the challenge associated with realizing this vision as articulated by the Global Research Council and how it intersects with mission-oriented science. Maria Juhl is co-chair of the Belmont Forum, a partnership of funding organizations, international science councils, and regional consortia committed to the advancement of interdisciplinary science. Maria, I'd like to invite you to share your perspectives on the role of national science funders as members of the Belmont Forum on the mission-oriented science.
Thank you, Nick. This is a great and wonderful opportunity, and thank you for inviting the Belmont Forum to join in this important gathering. For a little quick background, the Belmont Forum is a consortium of 31 primarily public funding agencies from over 55 countries. And for the past 10 years, we've come together to mobilize resources to support transdisciplinary and systems approaches to address critical challenges that humanity faces in terms of global environmental change and sustainability. So during this time, we've mobilized over about $400 million to support 150 projects involving over 2,000 researchers from 71 countries. As the Belmont Forum, as a group, we recognize that delivering the Sustainable Development Goals is a critical challenge for society, and that science can and should play a critical role in helping to solve our most pressing problems and set us all on a path toward global sustainability. We recognize that our problems really are larger than one field of science or nation or organization can solve on its own, and we are dedicated to international cooperation to help create opportunities for science to play its critical role. We fully recognize the need to break down funding silos and to promote the transdisciplinary and systems approaches to solutions development. For the Belmont Forum, transdisciplinary means that societal needs are front and center of the research that we particularly fund. In essence, we are dedicated to mission and solutions-oriented science that incorporates natural and social science, engineering, humanities, along with local and traditional knowledge to develop solutions to pressing problems and to engage stakeholders and decision makers along the whole journey of this. We fully recognize that reaching the SDGs is going to require full and active engagement of policy and decision makers at all scales, from global, national, regional, and local. And so we are dedicated and have been for the past 10 years to lowering barriers to funding international consortia, to engage in transdisciplinary and systems approaches to research that can provide information and engage with stakeholders and decision makers to help accelerate transformations to sustainability. Toward this end, the Belmont Forum and its partners have helped build an international community to address critical global change and sustainability issues, and we have sought to break down these silos of traditional science funding and to create opportunities for us to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, while we're proud of these accomplishments, we fully recognize that there is so much more to be done. There are still many, many barriers to supporting this type of mission-oriented science for sustainability, and I think Albert, in his presentation, provided us with several the critical pieces that really do need to be addressed. In addition, we need to create more opportunities for the international community to develop the capacity to undertake this type of science. So that means we need to be able to create spaces for the different silos that we currently have in disciplinary sciences to come together to work around a problem using systems approaches. We also need a more streamlined funding approach. Belmont Forum is a very small initiative. It has been, yes, it's been successful, but I think what we can look at and learn from the Belmont Forum experience is that this kind of approach is practical and can be successful, but it's time really to scale this whole approach up. In addition, while we are still proud of our 31 public funding agencies over 55 countries, we are critically lacking participation and support for Global South cooperations. And so moving forward, it will be imperative for the funding community to come together and create opportunities to level the playing field, to create capacity for different organizations to join in from the Global South especially, to approach the groups to work together and create those much needed solutions for our critical problems. So there is really an urgent need to increase the impact and support for mission-oriented science so that we can accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And I believe that the Global Forum of Funders is on a great track to help mobilize that change and to create the transformations that we need. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I think it was very helpful that you've identified a number of what you see as critical steps, or rather what the Belmont Forum sees as critical steps to realize mission-oriented science. And now I'd like to turn to Anna Maria Oltorp, the head of research cooperation at the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. She will share with us her perspectives on the role of development aid agencies in advancing the mission-oriented science for sustainable development. Anna Maria.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here to take part in this discussion. And I want to start by repeating and emphasizing what Albert said, that there is an urgent need to increase the impact and support for missions-oriented science in order to accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But there are major challenges to do so, and different funding communities really need to work together. And we're talking, I'm representing the bilateral aid agencies. And then we have the national research funders, and of course the foundations and philanthropists. And we really need to work together to mobilize funding and find mechanisms where we can fund truly global research, where researchers from all countries can participate and join on equal terms. And that's really a key. The Sustainable Development Goals sets up global challenges to a large extent, but we also know that these global challenges, they demand local solutions. And in order to find those local solutions, we need to work closely with actors and researchers also in low and middle income countries. Today, we see that the majority of research is really taking place in the global north. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa, only 0.4% of GDP goes into research, and part of that is funded by development agencies. In Europe and North America, the average is 2.5%. Sub-Saharan Africa has 100 million researchers, or 100 researchers per million population, whereas the number in North America and Europe is 1,200. And so we see that also the research agenda is set in the global north. So development agencies as Sida often fund research where the themes and focus is determined in the countries of the development aid agencies. What Sida has tried to do is primarily support research organizations based in the global south. And we've also been part of the Belmont Forum calls to put money into those for researchers from low-income countries to be able to participate and also be primary investigators. And what we also see, we need to fund the best and the most relevant research. And we are not today. Since we are not involving researchers from a large part of the world, we are not doing that. And IDRC a few years back in the International Development Research Center in Canada did an evaluation of the research funded and showed that the best and most relevant research, development research, is carried out by local researchers in the global south. And that South-South collaboration was of better quality and relevance than North-South collaborations. So that clearly shows the importance of having truly global research. So this means we need to fund missions-oriented research that is open on equal terms for all research, regardless of geographical background. And the research agenda needs to be set also involving researchers and research organizations in low and middle income countries. And we need to find the mechanisms. I think this is really key, mechanisms whereby we can join hands among different funders to do this, because as a development agency, we can clearly support researchers from low and middle income countries and research actors. And I think one important initiative in this is the Science Granting Council's initiative, where 16 research councils in 15 African countries are working together. And I think this initiative could be important in this work. And this initiative is funded jointly by Sida, IDRC Canada, FCDO Britain, and NRF South Africa. We've heard the national research councils can often fund researchers from their countries. And development agencies can then fund researchers from very many more countries. And then foundations also have their limitations. So how can we then mobilize funding among the three funding groups to have a mechanism where we can have sufficient funding? Because we've heard that missions-oriented research, we need large-scale funding. And I'm really pleased that we are having a high-level dialogue ongoing among these funding groups, and that we now have the report that Albert was presenting. And I'm also very pleased that IIASA has taken on the role to facilitate this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna-Maria. And I really appreciate you citing some quite specific examples of mechanisms, as you refer to them, which reflect, an approach that we can be taking to mission-oriented science. I'm now going to call on Peter Gluckman, President-elect of the International Science Council, to share his views. I understand that he does his best work at 2 a.m. in New Zealand, and it's pretty close to that time now. So special thanks to Peter for making the effort to join today.
Thanks, Nick. And I want to thank Albert in particular for laying down a challenge which we just have to meet. While the development of the COVID vaccines was a triumph of mission-led science, the variable uptake of the public health evidence into the political and public responses to the pandemic reflects a crisis in science and its use in the current context. As we proceed into the second year of the pandemic, we're years from resolving the social, financial, and multilateral issues that the pandemic has revealed, even if we do find a way through the arms race between the virus and vaccines. But sadly, for many countries and many people in both the global north and especially the global south, that's a long way from being resolved. Yet, at the same time, we must fight to make progress on the global agenda. The existential threats of climate change, food and water security, of mental health, of societal cohesion, and much more are in our face. And Albert has summarized those challenges well. The SDGs have long been identified in one way or another as a priority of both foundations and national research funding bodies. But yet, as all the speakers have acknowledged, we're not making sufficient progress. There are lessons to learn here from COVID. The international collaboration that led to rapid vaccine development was mission-led. The missions were clear, funding was provided, collaboration rapidly developed, knowledge exchanged. Scientific ingenuity was not suppressed, rather it was orientated to beating the virus. While there was much individual science undertaken during COVID, it was the mission-led approach that led to the rapid breakthroughs. But when we look at the research needed to meet the challenges, research funded to meet the challenge of the global commons, it's largely been driven by the mandates of individual funders, often in turn reflecting national or donor interest, rather than systematically addressing the rate-limiting steps for progress on the major issues ahead of us. Such nationally focused research is of immense importance to those countries, but it's driven largely by the interests and priorities of the funder, not by the collective global assessment of the research needed to save the planet and the people who live on it. And much of the research needed is characterized in a very different way to the classic domain-driven investigator-led research. It needs to be systems-focused. Nearly all of the issues involve social science and humanities and indigenous and local knowledge, as well as the natural sciences, and thus stakeholders must be engaged in truly interdisciplinary activity. And the science must inform policy, local communities and technologists and companies on the steps forward. Much of the research will have to deal with the challenges of social license for new technologies and issues such as why policymakers and decision makers are resistant to responding appropriately to risk analysis and risk assessments. So in addition to the type of science governments and foundations have traditionally funded, we need a new mechanism, one that can identify the key research needs for the planet and support that critical research needed by bringing together disciplined stakeholders and nationalities to address that research needed for which has global implications and which will accelerate progress on the goals, not simply progress in academia. Such multilateral mission-led research in some ways is not new. It was what was achieved in 1957 in the International Geophysical Year. In the 1970s, CIGAR was similarly constructed to address issues in food production. And Albert has mentioned how we come together in big science projects like CERN and the Square Kilometre Array. But what we now need, as Albert has indicated, is an urgency to create a globally accessible, mission-led mechanism to address several key areas where the existential risk is high. We need funders, whether national or philanthropic, to be prepared to subsume their own mandates into a global mandate. We need scientists and policymakers to work together and agree the core missions that will progress the global commons issues. We need funding to be through a common mechanism rather than adventitious through individual, often uncoordinated, often duplicative and competitive funding schemes, which leave gaps, particularly where transdisciplinary approaches are needed. In many ways, this is highly revolutionary. We need to accept that the reality is that much of the very research needed is not well funded, not identified, and indeed very difficult to be accessed. Most funders are narrow in how they will spend their funds. They generally use bottom-up approaches driven by institutional and individual incentives and with linear approaches with minimal strategic analysis. Outside the G20 of countries, the group of countries, funds for research are limited by the very nature and size of the economies, yet much knowledge and many key perspectives lie beyond. And the level of coordination, while talked about in practice, is relatively limited. The urgency is clear. We need those who have the capacity to change how science operates to work together, to co-design new ways of working. Put simply, the current model is not working for the global good, and therefore for the national good. Collectively, we cannot be complacent. There's an urgency to reset the focus of science, to re-engage the scientific community, governments and other stakeholders to agree on the core agenda for knowledge acquisition and application if we're to save the Earth and its inhabitants. The ISC, the International Science Council, as the global voice of science, is taking a lead in promoting discussion of this challenge. As you have heard already, we've received good support from funders, but it's ultimately governments and donors that have the mandate. To this end, We'll be inviting government, agencies, donors, funders, academies, and leaders of civil society to join with us in a dialogue to co-design a new mechanism to create a mission-led approach. This will be chaired by a global statesperson or persons, not by scientists, because ultimately, as Albert's pointed out, this is a socio-political challenge. And we hope to design and reach an agreement on how to proceed within the next 18 months. We would hope member states see the need for such a mechanism and will support a global effort to address the core issues that are threatening us all. We're less than a generation away from a global warming, which will almost certainly be well in excess of 1.5 degrees. In the consultations we've been doing during this project on the longer term consequences of COVID, it's become increasingly clear that before that terrible milestone is reached, there are many other risks to the human condition, political and social, which will in turn impede progress on the sustainability agenda. Let's not forget that the SDGs do not just encompass environmental sustainability, they encompass every component of the human, environmental, economic, and political condition. We must collectively take a much more holistic approach, but one that has intent, focus, energy, and urgency. It's time to do things differently and with imagination and collaboration. As Albert has said in his presentation, incremental progress is not commensurate with saving the planet and its biota. It's time to be transformative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, I think, for a very clear call to action there. I think it was particularly useful to have the comparison with the response to the global pandemic, COVID. And I think you're also really very clear around some of the key features around this mechanism that mission-oriented science calls for. And I want to actually go back to that last bit there around this mechanism, because we've heard quite a bit about the operating context of science currently. We've heard quite a bit about the call for change. And I want to ask each of the panelists now, quite precisely, what you see as the key feature as science funders of this global mechanism. What, from your perspective, would be a key feature of this global mechanism that would consolidate and accelerate mission-oriented science? And I'm going to start, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, but I think it's quite useful for us to start thinking, okay, so what are we doing? What are we talking about exactly? Okay, imagine that, you know, folks are now mobilized to do something and they want to hear a bit about, okay, what is that going to look like? What should they be actually now actively lobbying around and thinking about? And I'm going to start, Albert, with you.
I think for me, the most critical factor is a common pot of funding that can drive this initiative. Without that, I think we're going to be stalled at the gates in the process of putting this together, just from my perspective.
Okay, so Albert is actually, okay, we need the money. It's that simple and that clear, which it's hard to argue with, right? Ingrid.
I think what's a little bit tricky now, it's also globally, we are working in silos. We have WHO, we have WTO, we have FIO. So where do you see the system? Will it be an ECOSOC, UNDP, and UNDP is more about development? For me, it's about have a common agenda, set priorities. And I think there are priorities set in the ISC work. There are some of the SDGs which are more in the center and which are driving the others. And then, of course, we need to put our resources on the table and to prioritize together. And we also need to support the Global South, because many of the problems are even more severe there. And I think that many of the solutions might come from researchers there. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, so basically, I'd say really important considerations here about making sure we get the institutional location right to host and drive this, and also making sure that we engage the Global South to provide leadership. And now, Maria.
I want to add to what Ingrid is saying is really important. the focus on the global south and their participation. But I think in order for us to put money into a mechanism, we need to look at it and see, build it up on what are the drivers for the different funding communities? What are our limitations? Because for development agencies, we really want to see that this is supporting research that is relevant in the participating countries. And for Sida, the fact that we have researchers from these countries participating is really key. But of course, we could fund projects, but we are not set up in such a way. So development agencies often need a mechanism where they can put in fairly substantial funds, but where they really can see where the funds are going. So the mechanism in itself is a key.
Okay, so it needs to be, I guess what you're suggesting is accountable, accessible, transparent, and legitimate, really, in that regard. Yeah.
True, and build on our different strengths in terms of funding communities.
Okay, and the Belmont Forum, Maria, from your perspective, key feature?
I think that we need primarily a culture change. As Albert pointed out, we are, to really make a dent in this, we do, I mean, as a funder, when someone says a common pot of money, you know, the hairs on the back of my neck kind of stand up and stuff, but that means that I, as a funder, need to think about changing my perspective. You know, nations, when we do these things and we come together, we want to be, let's see, transparent, and we want to be accountable to the people who are putting the money in. So basically your taxpayers in most places. So I think we need to really think about how do we come together and change the culture of this and get everyone on the same page about what the critical priorities are and how do we go about changing those. And there was also a question in the chat here about you know, the science community. And I also think there needs to be a culture change there as well. You know, a lot of the science community is worried about, especially in higher education, are worried about tenure, promotion, and things. And this kind of science doesn't necessarily lend itself to accelerating your career to greatness. So we really need to think about the culture change, not only within governmental funding, but also the science community itself. In addition, we also need to think about how funders can come together to work and understand each other so that we can go from that basic research, which is critical in addressing all of this, all the way to local decision making. And that is a spectrum. And we need to be able to mobilize those groups that are working along that to work together. So it would be great to have a common pot, but if we don't actually agree on the steps on how this needs to move forward, it's not really going to matter. So we're going to need money and a culture change.
Okay.
So that's a long-winded explanation.
No, but I think actually it's a really important one because you've touched on, I think, a number of really critical issues for us to address to make this real, right? And I do want to come back to Albert around the issue around the culture change in academia, and I'll do that in a minute. But Peter, I really have to give you also a chance to reflect quickly on what you would see as the critical feature. I mean, you raised a number, I think, again, of really important features of this mechanism. But if you were going to be forced to prioritize, yes.
The key issue, which is across all of the sustainability agenda, is getting individual governments to understand that it's in their national self-interest to work collectively for the global interest. And that's true in the areas we're talking about, as it is in other domains such as diplomacy, etc., etc. I agree with all the speakers, but I do feel that the key issue is there is not an organization, an institution that has both priority setting and funding, which is independent of mandates of individual organizations. Whatever else is said, we'll still remain in some form of siloed, disconnected way, and will not achieve progress. The collective mandate that is beyond the mandate of individual funders is critical. And the other point I would make is there's an area of research that must be brought right to the top of the agenda, and it's cross-cutting across all of it. And that is how we span from knowledge development to using that knowledge in the appropriate places rapidly to achieve what knowledge can do. If you take an area like food security, we probably have the bulk of the technical knowledge we need to actually address the challenges of food security. It's the implementation of that knowledge which is totally lacking. And so I think this is the kind of cross-cutting research that needs to be a genuine global effort, but it comes back to the point, national self-interest is to address the global commons. That is the message that we need to address.
No, and I understand this. I recognize that actually there is a lot that we, as part of the science community and as science funders ourselves, can interrogate around our own assumptions about how knowledge is brokered and how policy engages with science. And I think that this is a really important point that you've raised here, Peter. Sorry, did you want to add something?
I want to make one more point, which is going to lead on to Albert, I'm sure. And that is, I agree fully with Maria that the culture of the science industry needs to change. There's an industry out there which operates too often for the interests of the institution or for the individual, rather than for the good of the society that ultimately funds it. And therefore, ISC in particular is going to be working very hard on how we can work with the other partners there to collectively change and transform the culture of science.
Okay, let's talk about this culture of science. It's come up a few times. I think, Albert, right at the beginning of your presentation, you set out a framework for what needs to change in the way that we approach the practice of science. And really, it's I think a very clear enumeration of the challenges that we have across these various epistemic communities around research. And immediately, my thought was, yes, and I wonder how much consensus there is around that. And as Maria says, there is a question that has come up, and I will just read it to you. Mission orientation is directional and intentional. I wonder whether the scientific community buys in to mission-oriented research. In many quarters, there is still hesitation and fear of politically guided research and a hesitation to engage in too applied research. Albert, the question for you is, to what extent do you think there is consensus across the research communities? And I think it's quite important for us to think about this, you know, not only academia, we have to kind of think here around the various spheres where research might be practiced. To what extent is there consensus for this particular intellectual framing for what we call mission-oriented science?
Thank you, Nick. To be honest, I don't think we'll ever have consensus around this issue from the academic community, but I can just point to some practices that I think will indicate to you that there are sufficiently large numbers of scientists that understand that the multilateral efforts that are required in terms of addressing these global challenges require multilateral scientific collaboration and cooperation. And I think you can look at some of the consensus and synthesis reports that fed into this exercise. Initiatives like the World in 2050, which was, you know, a large number of people participating in these kinds of activities. But I think at the same time, there are activities like the IPCC and the IPBES that are focusing on particular global challenges and trying to do it in the context of the global frameworks within which they were established. I think that there are sufficient scientists that feel that we are not going to resolve these global matters if we don't cooperate and collaborate in the most appropriate manner. I think what we're trying to do is to harness that goodwill and that willingness to participate in these processes from around the globe and create mechanisms and institutions that allow those people to make the kind of inputs that will allow rapid delivery of these objectives to the best of our ability. At the moment, I think that community is fighting against the tide in terms of trying to make this contribution, and I think we need to try and assist and help and guide. And I think in this regard, I don't think the principle is that we're looking for politically guided research. We're looking for participation from the political sector at the same time. So it's a partnership. We don't see this as a politically guided initiative.
Okay, I think this is actually a really useful clarification and framing, Albert. There's a lot of interaction in both the chat and the Q&A sections, which is very pleasing. I'm a little concerned that we're going to run out of time, but let me try to address as many questions as I can quickly. And the questions, they keep coming thick and fast and all very interesting. One question here, I hear the desperation behind this question and I feel obliged to pose it to the panel. And it goes back a bit to what Albert is saying here, really, about making sure that we get the right kind of participation from stakeholders. And the question is, in the end, what do we as researchers have to do concretely to wake the media and politicians up to reality? How can we draw attention to what is happening, and how do we, I guess here, work with funders to make our voices heard despite the material and financial interests of governments and politicians? So to me, at the heart of this question here is, can we as researchers mobilize enough interests to have what Peter has described as, the commitment of this, I don't want to say apolitical because that's not quite it, but this collective, global collective interests, which transcends national interests, which transcends industrial interests. What can researchers do to get there? And what can researchers do with funders to get there? And I think this is a very simple, direct, but extremely important question, because it is at the heart of what we're trying to get at. And we really need to engage with the geopolitical realities. So I am thinking I'm going to actually go to, I see Maria's nodding vigorously. So Maria, I'm going to come to you, but actually it won't just be you. I will also, turn to some of your colleagues for their reflections.
So I think it's a fantastic question, because I think for too long, the academic community has really sort of not engaged in setting priorities and pushing governments to address critical issues. I think the climate issue we have now is probably one of the big movements that we have. And I can say, from a funder's point of view, we listen to our community. So if the community comes to us and says, we need this, we will actually respond to that. So if there's a critical mass of people who are coming in and beating down the door at NSF in particular, and it's going to be different in each different country. But for the United States, if you come in and there's a huge push toward, we need this, but there has to be a good critical mass of people to do that, to, not only come to us, but also go toward engaging with decision makers to help influence where the funding actually ends up going, and to support those actions. So, for lack of a better word, and I'm not sure if I want to use this, but to get more, let's say, engaged in the process of directing appropriations in your country and raising the awareness of what needs to be done. You have to be a bit more active and engaged in where the appropriations are coming from.
Okay, very helpful. And Ingrid?
I think that Peter gave a very good example when the mission about the vaccine. The research community responded very rapidly. They work with open science. now when we are going to distribute the vaccine, the global community has failed, as Albert say. So there the research community was successful. I think it's important here to also to have a discussion about what's facts and what's values, so that we are not mixing science with politics too much, to be really sure, because you might even have the same facts, but you might have different values and your actions are different. So I think we need to have this dialogue. And I think what's most important here is just a respectful dialogue between the different stakeholders, because you are coming from different perspectives. Thank you.
I think this is a really interesting set of observations, and you're right. I think that, you know, again, going back to Peter's, I think, extremely useful metaphorical framing around the COVID vaccine. There is actually, you see a very clear distinction between the development of the vaccine and then the issue of the rollout, and the ways in which actually the politics of nationhood start to play out. I also think it's very interesting when we think about science, and one of the issues that we need to grapple with is when science intersects with societal value systems. And, you know, there is a school of thought in science communication that says we are now in a different era of scientific practice, the post-normal, where in fact it is very difficult to distinguish scientific fact from values, and that we are now, because of where science has evolved to, we are invariably going to find ourselves negotiating between fact and values, and this is going to be a feature of science going forward. Yes, Peter, is there something you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to say, and of course, the whole point of transdisciplinary approaches is the only mechanism to deal with that post-normal reality. And we need to accept that if we're going to deal with the wicked problems, and that's what we're talking about here, if we don't take a genuinely transdisciplinary approach, which is both, has two elements to it in my mind. One is framing the question through multiple perspectives from the outset, and secondly, genuine stakeholder engagement from the outset. And so the engagement is actually part of the research process. We're not going to make progress. And that's why I think, and the reality is, because the current science funding systems are largely those developed in the 1960s and 1970s in a very linear reductionist model of science, it's actually very hard for the science community to find ways to significantly work in the transdisciplinary place. And that's not to say there aren't examples out there, but it's actually very, very difficult. And I think that's part of the transformation of the science system that has to occur rapidly if we're to make progress on these issues. And it involves the funders, it involves the employers, it involves the science academies, it involves the publication industry, it involves a whole lot of players. And I think a mechanism such as that, which Albert and I have proposed, would be the kind of breakthrough mechanism which in itself would be transformative for other parts of the science system, thinking about the criticality of true transdisciplinary research. We need to understand those words, transdisciplinary, and should be properly defined and properly used in the science community.
Okay, this is very interesting. I have two follow-up questions on that, Peter. One of them, in fact, comes from Ingrid in our audience, who says, do we need a research and innovation summit where heads of state should meet, have a dialogue and make commitments? Would that be helpful? Or would that be a distraction in view of what you were just saying?
Well, the ISC is actually working towards that particular kind of dialogue. It's not just a summit of leaders, it's a summit of the key science policy actors, of which there are more than just political leaders. And what I alluded to in my final comments was the ISC is in the process of dialogue with potential chairs of a group of people to work over the next 18 months for a summit that's putatively proposed for January 2023, hosted by the Sultan of Oman in Muscat. So we're working on that as we speak.
Okay, but I guess what is to me intriguing about this particular question and how it relates to the point you were making earlier is that actually it's not obviously just about the science community coming together.
No, not at all.
Yeah, and that this is, in fact, what you were talking about here are policy leads at a national and regional level across the board, irrespective of their particular position in relation to science practice, as it were.
And there's one other group of people that need to be considered, and that are the science diplomats. There are not many of them, but they are very important people. The people that are actually using science as an important diplomatic tool. And I wish more countries had science advisors within their foreign ministries. I think if we did, we might make more progress.
And the other question that I had is around the role of industry, because obviously there is a lot of money that's invested in research. There's an enormous amount of research capacity there. We obviously, our instinct is to say, well, you know, these are stakeholders, important stakeholders, maybe we should be engaging them as well. But of course, there are very particular agendas that come with these industry folks. And again, I would like to hear your reflections on this. You know, what are the possibilities? What are the risks? How do we manage this? I see Albert has unmuted himself in anticipation. Albert.
Thank you, Nick. I think this is critically important. And I think that this is part of the reason why this transdisciplinary approach about joint agenda setting is so important. If we can't go through a process of establishing a collective agenda that we all agree on, we're going to be pulling each other apart in all kinds of directions. There's got to be a common agenda on the table that all the role players around the table are prepared to drive. And if it's something simple like landing somebody on the moon, not that the exercise itself is simple, but as a concept in terms of something that everybody can understand, if we put those missions on the table very clearly and quite explicitly in a collective process, I think we will get much closer towards getting the buy-in that we want. And then, of course, the support will follow as a consequence of that. But again, it's not the place of science to determine on behalf of industry what the priorities are. Let's have a conversation and let's find out where the common ground is.
Okay. Yes, Maria.
I'd just like to pick up on something that Albert said here. The industry is a critical player in this, and sustainability is not going to be achieved unless we actually have sustainable industry and business practices and you know, economics and the whole spectrum. And so science can't do this without the engagement of this group, because we for years have been, you know, doing our thing, throwing it over the fence, and some places are picking up, some aren't. So I think it's really critical to have society and industry deeply involved in these conversations. And, you know, one of the things that Future Earth is doing is to actually work with the Global Commons Alliance to help industry set what we call science-based targets for their particular sector, to understand how their operations and their practices contribute to either improved sustainable or the detriment of sustainability. So we really need to have that be a holistic and inclusive conversation. Otherwise, we're just not gonna, I mean, we can't ignore the driving force behind how we all live. You can't get rid of industry, because if we did, we wouldn't have anything. And so, you know, I think Peter's point about coming together around the pandemic was, you know, the science did a great job with this. Well, sustainability is the same way, but this way we need to get science around there. We need society, we need policy, we need industry. We all live on one planet and we all contribute to the whole. And if we're not actively engaged in figuring out how to deal with these wicked problems, because there are trade-offs and there are balances, and every time we make a decision, it's going to impact something else. And so if we're not thinking about the whole systems and a collective approach, we're just going to be working at cross purposes.
And I think this is a really important point about, I guess, what you would call dependency pathways, you know, because actually the reality is that the way that we live now, the things that are driving the crisis that we have at the moment is really about our lifestyles, consumption patterns, ideas of growth and development and so on. And I want to now turn to Anna Maria, because there's a question here, which I think is equally awkward around the reality of engaging researchers from the Global South in particular, because we're talking here about multidimensionally resource constrained environments. And oftentimes we will say, a little bit like we say with industry, yeah, industry should be part of the you know, should be at the table. But, you know, as Maria was just explaining, okay, that's a special effort. It is absolutely important, but it is a special effort. And I feel the same thing around the global equity of research and the opportunity for leadership from the Global South, because in fact, it does require a special effort. And the question, I feel the pain behind this question here about, you know, what are the mechanisms to support the collaborations by funding agencies in the Global South in a context where funding is the most limiting factor. But as I would argue, it is not by any means the only factor, because there are a bunch of dependencies that actually come around this. And so again, for you, Anna Maria, how do we take this seriously? What do we need to be doing about this in the context of mission-oriented science? Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. No, I think of course, there are limitations and there are capacity needs, but there are also a large number of very strong researchers in low and middle income countries, research organizations, networks that would love to be around the table. And so they really need the platform. They need to be invited to the decision-making forum. And so I think that's where we could come in and make sure that they are with this mechanism. And there, the development agencies could come in and fund in the cases there is need for funding. Because I also think that being part of some of these calls needs funding. But then again, development agencies, this is where we should play a part. And I just wanted to say, because we are in a strategy process where we've had consultation with all our partners, international organizations, but very many research networks and research organizations and universities in low and middle income countries. And what comes up in all these consultations is the need for transdisciplinary research and implementation research. So they stand behind this. So we don't see a homogeneous research community. We have so many that really wants to do this. And I think among the younger generation researchers, they are really looking for this because that's where they want to contribute. But then, of course, we need to look at reward systems to really keep their engagement there, because I think we're losing a lot of talented young people who are not wanting to go into the traditional research field.
Thank you, Anna Maria. I think actually that is a lovely place for us to bring our session to an end. A bit of a reality check there about the opportunity and possibility as opposed to just the crisis that we're facing. The ISC with its partners is working on building a coalition willing to support mission-oriented science. And if you're interested to be involved, do not hesitate to get in touch with the ISC. and the Global Forum of Funders. The report on mission science will be published in the next month and will be available on the ISC website, but you will also receive an email. There'll be a message about that in the chat. And I would like now to thank our speakers for sharing their inspiring insights and taking time out of their busy days or nights in some cases. And of course, I want to thank you, the participants, for your very active engagement. As I said, we really value the rich discussion that has been on the chat and also the intelligence behind a lot of the questions that you've posed. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to address all of them individually. And I also want to thank the high-level panel for providing this opportunity to present this work. And of course, thanks to the team at the ISC and the work that they've been doing behind the scenes, especially Katia, who is the Secretariat for the Global Forum of Funders. Thank you all very much.